The dust of the plains clings to everything, a fine red powder that settles in the creases of a man's thoughts and seasons his fears. Inside the small, sturdy cabin, Thomas feels it coating his tongue. He stands by the single window, rifle held so tight his knuckles are bone-white, and watches the riders circle. They are shadows against the bruised twilight, 7 of them, moving with the patient, predatory grace of wolves testing a pen. Outside, the wind whispers through the sparse pines, a lonely sound that usually brings comfort, but now sounds like a harbinger, reciting the names of the dead. His wife, Ilara, is silent behind him, her presence a pool of stillness in the churning terror of the moment. The gentle swell of her belly beneath her simple cotton dress is the only future he has ever dared to build, and it is surrounded. The riders stop. A man detaches from the group, his silhouette broad and menacing. There is no parley, no shouted demand. There is only the certainty of violence coiling in the dusk, waiting to strike. That's one hell of a welcome wagon. Before we see how Thomas and Ilara face the wolves at their door, tell us in the comments, what's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe for more tales of frontier courage. The situation is as stark and unforgiving as the landscape itself. They are miles from the nearest settlement, their homestead a tiny anchor of hope in a vast, indifferent ocean of rock and scrub. Thomas knows the men outside are not lost travelers or curious dragoons. They are the human predators of this land, men who feed on the isolation of others. He can feel Ilara's fear, a current running just beneath her calm exterior. It is for her, and for the child she carries, that a cold, precise rage is beginning to burn away the edges of his own terror. He is not a man of violence, but he is a man of fierce devotion. He will make them pay for every inch of ground they try to take. The leader raises a hand, and with a sudden, coordinated surge, the bandits spur their horses forward, their war cries shattering the fragile peace. The world narrows to the space between one heartbeat and the next. The air in the cabin had changed the moment the riders were spotted. Until then, it had been filled with the scent of baking bread and the low hum of Ilara's voice as she moved about their small, ordered world. Every object in the room was a testament to their shared labor and quiet dreams. The rough-hewn table Thomas had built from pine, sanded smooth by Ilara's patient hands. The colorful patchwork quilt on their bed, pieced together from scraps of her old dresses, each square a memory. The empty cradle in the corner, waiting with a kind of hopeful reverence for the life that was coming. They had been here for nearly a year, carving a life from the unyielding soil. Thomas, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the soil than a rifle, had proven resilient. He was not large, but his frame was corded with the lean, hard muscle of constant work. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, and his eyes, a steady blue, held a kindness that seemed out of place in this harsh territory. He had come west not for gold or glory, but for the simple, profound desire for a patch of earth to call his own, a place to build a life with the woman he loved. Ilara was his quiet counterpoint. Her movements were gentle, her voice soft, but beneath the placid surface lay a strength Thomas had come to rely on. She had a connection to the world that he sometimes envied. She could read the sky for rain, find water where he saw only cracked earth, and soothe a spooked horse with a touch and a murmur. She was an orphan, raised in a stern missionary school back east, and her past was a book she rarely opened. He knew only that she had been found as a small child, wandering alone after a raid had claimed her family, and had been taken in. The school had given her a new name, a new religion, and a new language, burying whatever had come before. Yet, sometimes, in her sleep, she would murmur words in a tongue he did not recognize, a ghostly echo of a forgotten life. The pregnancy had softened her, but it had also kindled a new fire in her, a fierce, protective instinct that mirrored his own. Their life was hard, a daily battle against drought, predators, and loneliness, but it was theirs. The baby was the promise that their struggle meant something, that they were planting roots that would hold. The memory of a passing trader a month ago soured the present moment. The man had looked at their small, isolated homestead with a pitying sneer. "Brave of you folks," he'd said, though his tone made it sound like foolish. "This stretch of land, it's got a bad habit of swallowing people up, especially with Cobra's gang getting bolder." He had spat a wad of tobacco near the woodpile. "They say Cobra's got ice in his veins and a ghost for a soul. Take care your little paradise here. Don't attract the wrong kind of attention." The warning now echoed in the cabin, a prophecy fulfilled. The splintering crash of the door ripped Thomas from his reverie. It flew inward, torn from its leather hinges, and the men flooded in behind it, bringing the cold night and the reek of whiskey and unwashed bodies with them. They were a nightmare given form. Hard, cruel faces under the sweat-stained brims of their hats. Their eyes darted around the small cabin, hungry and contemptuous, taking in every detail of the life they were about to shatter. Thomas got one shot off from his rifle. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. One of the men grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of enraged surprise. But before Thomas could lever another round into the chamber, he was overwhelmed. A fist slammed into his jaw, sending a spray of stars across his vision. The rifle was torn from his grasp, and he was thrown to the floor, the hard-packed earth knocking the wind from him. Rough hands bound his wrists behind his back with a practiced, brutal efficiency. He could only watch, helpless, as the leader stepped over him. This must be Cobra. He was taller than the others, with a stillness that was more menacing than their boisterous aggression. He moved with a liquid deadliness, his eyes, dark and flat as river stones, missing nothing. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on the cradle before settling on Alara. Alara had not screamed. She stood backed against the far wall, her hands protectively covering her belly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide and defiant. She looked like a cornered doe, poised between terror and a final, hopeless fight. Well, one of the bandits chortled a grimy man with a missing front tooth. "Look what we got here, boys. A cozy little nest, and a pretty little bird." He took a step toward Alara, his intentions stark and ugly. Thomas strained against his bonds, a raw, guttural sound of fury tearing from his throat. "Don't you touch her." The man just laughed. "Or what, farmer? You'll plow me a new furrow." But the leader, Cobra, moved his head just slightly. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. The man stopped, ransacked the place. Cobra's voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. "Take the food, the whiskey. Find out if he's got any money stashed." He looked at Thomas on the floor. "Tie him to the chair. I want him to watch." The men fell upon the cabin with a vicious glee, tearing apart the life Thomas and Alara had so carefully built. Sacks of flour were ripped open, their precious contents dusting the floor like snow. The quilt was torn from the bed, the jars of preserved vegetables smashed against the wall. It was a violation, a desecration. Through it all, Thomas's eyes were locked on Alara, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. The man who had been shot was groaning, his anger mounting. Another, drunker than the rest, stumbled towards Alara again, waving a bottle. "Come on, pretty bird," he slurred. "Have a drink with us. Let's have some fun." The air grew thick and volatile. The men were a tinderbox of drink, greed, and violence, and this man was the spark. Thomas saw the flash of pure terror in Alara's eyes, the moment her composure finally threatened to break. He thrashed in the chair, the ropes cutting into his wrists. "Leave her alone, you coward." It was then that Alara did something no one could have predicted. As the drunken bandit reached for her, she closed her eyes. Her hands, still resting on her belly, pressed down gently, and she began to sing. It was not a hymn from her missionary school, nor a folk song from the eastern towns. The sound that filled the small, violated cabin was strange, ancient, and utterly mesmerizing. It was a lullaby, but it was like no lullaby these men had ever heard. The melody was haunting, built on a scale that was alien to their ears, rising and falling like the soft cry of a night bird. The words were in that other language, the one from her dreams, flowing like a gentle stream over smooth stones. The drunken bandit froze, his hand outstretched, his mouth agape. The other men, in the midst of their destruction, slowly turned, their expressions shifting from brutal glee to slack-jawed confusion. The song was a shield. It was a prayer. It was a sound so pure and unexpected that it seemed to scour the filth from the air. It spoke of soaring eagles and sleeping rivers, of a mother's love as wide and patient as the night sky. It was a song of deep peace dropped into a cauldron of violence. Thomas stared at his wife, his own fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a profound astonishment. He had never heard her sing this song awake. He had never heard it sung with such clarity, such desperate, fragile power. And across the room, the leader, Cobra, stood utterly still. His head was cocked, his body rigid. The stone flatness of his eyes was gone, replaced by an expression of intense, unreadable concentration. He was not just listening. He was absorbing the song, letting it wash over him, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. He waved a hand, a sharp, dismissive gesture at the drunken man, who shuffled back as if struck. The leader's gaze was fixed solely on Alara, on the pregnant woman who stood amidst the ruin of her home, holding 7 vicious killers captive with nothing but a forgotten melody. The song ended, the last note hanging in the sudden, absolute silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the men. No one moved. The spell was cast. Alara, her eyes still closed, took a shaky breath. She had thrown her only stone, and for a moment, the wolves had paused. The question that hung in the air, heavier than any threat, was for how long. Cobra took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving her face. The entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his verdict. For the next several hours, a strange and tense truce settled over the cabin. The bandits, their initial frenzy broken by the song, seemed uncertain. They drank Thomas's whiskey and ate his cured meat, but the vicious energy had dissipated, replaced by a wary, sullen mood. They muttered among themselves, casting confused and suspicious glances at Alara, who had sunk into the remaining chair, her face pale with exhaustion. Thomas remained tied to his own chair, a helpless spectator to the bizarre theater unfolding in his home. The leader, Cobra, had not spoken another word. He sat on a crate near the hearth, sharpening a long knife with slow, deliberate strokes, but his attention was elsewhere. His gaze kept drifting to Alara, a dark, searching look that made Thomas's blood run cold. It wasn't the leering look of the other men. It was something deeper, more analytical, and far more unsettling. He was trying to solve a puzzle, and Alara was the key. One of the men, a wiry outlaw with cruel eyes named Jax, grew restless. He'd been the one who seemed most resistant to the song's strange power. "What are we waiting for, Cobra?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Let's finish this. There's a posse from Willow Creek that patrols this way. We should be long gone before morning." Cobra didn't look up from his knife. "We'll leave when I say we leave." "And the farmer and his squaw?" Jax pressed, kicking at a broken piece of pottery on the floor. "We ain't leaving witnesses, are we?" Cobra's hand stopped moving. He slowly raised his head, and the chilling emptiness was back in his eyes. "Are you questioning my orders, Jax?" Jax flinched, but held his ground. "I'm just saying, that woman, there's something not right about her. That song she was singing, it's like some kind of devilry." He looked at Alara with a mixture of fear and contempt. "She's bewitched you." With a movement so fast, it was almost a blur, Cobra was on his feet and had the tip of his newly sharpened knife pressed against Jax's throat. The other men froze, their hands hovering near their pistols. "The next man who calls her a squaw or a witch will learn to speak with a slit throat," Cobra hissed, his voice dangerously soft. "She is a prisoner. Nothing more. We needed a place to lie low until the moon sets. This is it. Now sit down and shut your mouth." He held the knife there for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Jax, his face ashen, gave a jerky nod. Cobra withdrew the blade and returned to his crate, as if nothing had happened. But a line had been drawn. He was protecting her. Thomas didn't understand it, and the mystery of it was more terrifying than simple brutality. A brutal man was predictable. This man was not. As the night deepened, a cold wind began to howl outside, rattling the frame of the broken door. The men grew more agitated, their nerves frayed by the confinement, the whiskey, and their leader's strange mood. Fights threatened to break out over the last of the bottle. It was Cobra who finally broke the simmering tension. He looked over at Alara, who sat with her eyes closed, her hands still cradling her belly. "Sing," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Alara's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, then at Thomas, her expression full of fear and uncertainty. Thomas tried to shake his head, to signal her not to, but he was powerless. "I said sing," Cobra repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. With a deep, shuddering breath, Alara began again. The haunting, melodic notes of the lullaby once more filled the cabin, and, just as before, a strange quiet descended. The men stopped their bickering, their faces going slack. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, laid his head down on the table and closed his eyes. Another leaned back against the wall, his hard face softening in the firelight. The song was a potent medicine, an antidote to the violence in their souls. Alara sang it through twice, her voice growing stronger, more confident with each verse. She was no longer just a victim. She was the keeper of this strange peace. When she finished, the silence that followed was different. It was not tense, but heavy, laden with a kind of communal melancholy. Cobra motioned for one of his men to bring Alara a cup of water and a piece of jerky. The man did so, his movements clumsy, almost reverent. Alara took it, her hand trembling slightly, and gave a small nod of thanks. Her gaze met Thomas's across the room, and he saw a flicker of the question that was consuming him. What is happening? Later, when most of the men were dozing in drunken, song-soothed sleep, Cobra moved from his spot by the fire. He walked over to Alara's chair and crouched down before her. The sheer size of him, the coiled danger in his posture, made her flinch. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice low enough so only she and Thomas could hear. Alara swallowed, her throat dry. I don't remember," she whispered, which was the truth. "It's just a memory, from when I was very small." "A memory of who?" he pressed, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Your mother." "I don't know my mother," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was raised in a school. They told me my family was gone." Cobra stared at her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be searching her face for something, some sign, some long-lost answer. He glanced at her hands, then at her neck and arms, as if looking for a mark. His scrutiny was so intense it felt like a physical touch. He seemed profoundly, deeply disappointed by what he didn't find. "It is a song of the NDE," he murmured, almost to himself. "The name for the Apache people, the Lapon Band. A song for calming a restless spirit." He looked at her belly. "Or a new one." A cold dread washed over Thomas. This wasn't random. The song meant something specific to him. Alara, an orphan raised by white missionaries, singing a specific Apache lullaby to a ruthless bandit leader who recognized it. The world had tilted on its axis. Cobra rose and walked back to the fire, leaving Alara trembling, her mind reeling. The lullaby was not just a forgotten tune. It was a key, and this brutal, terrifying man held the lock. She now understood that her song was not just a shield. It was a beacon, and she had no idea what she had summoned. As the wind howled its lonely song outside, Alara felt a new kind of fear, one that was colder and more profound than the fear of mere violence. It was the fear of a past she could not remember and a future she could no longer predict. Her fate, and Thomas's, was now inextricably linked to the mystery of a melody. The false dawn was a pale, gray wound in the eastern sky. The wind had died down, and an eerie quiet had settled both inside and outside the cabin. The bandits began to stir, groaning and stretching, the harsh reality of the morning chasing away the strange, sad peace of the night. Their faces, in the thin light, were once again hard and predatory. The magic of the lullaby had faded with the darkness. Jax was the first to his feet, his eyes landing on Thomas, still bound to the chair, and Alara, who looked as if she hadn't slept at all. "Time to go, Cobra," he said, his voice sharp with renewed purpose. "Let's finish our business here." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. The other men got to their feet, their intentions clear. The truce was over. The reprieve had ended. Thomas struggled against his ropes, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the moment he had been dreading all night. He looked at Alara, trying to pour a lifetime of love and apology into a single, desperate glance. Cobra stood up slowly, his back to the hearth. He looked at his men, then at his prisoners. His face was a mask of stone, betraying none of the turmoil that had been visible the night before. For a terrible second, Thomas was certain that the leader had reverted to form, that the strange connection had been a fleeting illusion. "He's right," Cobra said, his voice flat. "It's time." He started walking toward Alara. Jax grinned, a cruel, satisfied expression. The other men readied their weapons. Thomas closed his eyes, a prayer dying on his lips. But Cobra did not draw his pistol. He stopped in front of Alara, his shadow falling over her. He looked down at her pale, exhausted face, at her hands still resting on the gentle curve of her belly. The air was thick with the finality of the moment. "One last time," he said, his voice now a raw, cracking whisper that was nothing like the commander the night before. "Sing it. For me." It was an impossible request, a death sentence delivered with a plea. Alara stared up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, terrible understanding. This was more than just a song to him. It was everything. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the profound, aching loss that was far older than this single night of violence. It was the look of a man clinging to the edge of a cliff with his fingertips. Her gaze flicked to Thomas, who was watching, his face a portrait of agony. As she looked back at Cobra, she had no choice. She was a musician being asked to play for the executioner. Taking a ragged breath that felt as if it were tearing her lungs, she began to sing. Her voice was weak at first, trembling and thin, full of the unshed tears of her terror. But as the familiar notes flowed, they found their strength. The lullaby unfurled in the silent cabin, more poignant and heartbreaking than ever before. It was a song of life in a room that smelled of death. It was a song of peace in the face of annihilation. As the melody swelled, a sound escaped Cobra's throat, a choked, guttural sob. His broad shoulders began to shake. The hard mask of the bandit leader did not just crack, it shattered. He fell to his knees before her, the sudden movement as shocking as a gunshot. His head bowed, and tears streamed down his weathered face, cutting clean paths through the grime and dust. He was no longer Cobra, the fearsome outlaw. He was a man broken open, undone by a simple, childish tune. His men stared, their mouths agape, their weapons forgotten in their hands. They looked from their weeping, kneeling leader to the pregnant woman who was still singing, her voice now filled with a strange, sorrowful power. They were witnessing the death of a myth, the unraveling of the man they feared and followed. Alara's voice faltered, the song catching in her throat as she watched him. He looked up, his face wrecked with a grief so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. His eyes, no longer flat and empty, were wild with pain and a desperate, dawning recognition. "That melody," he choked out, his voice thick with tears. "The way you end the verse, only one person ever sang it that way." He reached out, his hand trembling, not to harm her, but to gently push back the sleeve of her dress from her left wrist. His breath hitched. There, on the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a small, faded birthmark, shaped like a tiny, lopsided crescent moon. He stared at it, his eyes tracing its shape as if it were a holy relic. Then he looked from a mark to her face, truly seeing her for the first time, looking past the settler's clothes and the fear, searching the very bones of her structure, the curve of her brow, the shape of her eyes. "It cannot be," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief and a terrible, rising hope. He spoke a name, not Alara, but a name from that other tongue, the language of the song. Shadizi, little sister. The name struck a deep, silent chord within her, a vibration from a life she couldn't remember. It felt familiar, a ghost of a sound from an impossible distance. But she was not his sister. The age was wrong. He was a hard man in his late 30s, at least. She was barely 20. He saw the confusion in her face, the impossibility of it all. His gaze dropped to her belly, to the new life she carried. His mind, shattered by the song and the sight of the mark, seemed to leap across the chasm of logic, driven by a grief that defied time and reason. He saw not a sister, but the continuation of a line he thought was extinguished forever. He saw the face of his mother, the spirit of his people, reborn in this woman who carried their song and their blood, who was about to become a mother herself. The conflict in his eyes resolved into a look of absolute, soul-shattering reverence. The grief, the hope, the years of violence and loss coalesced into a single, sacred recognition. He bowed his head until his forehead touched the dusty floorboards. And from his lips came the word that broke the world in two, a word spoken not to a captive, but to a holy icon. "Nantie," he breathed, the Apache word soft and full of awe. Mother. He had not called her a mother. He had called her mother. A title, an honorific, a surrender. He was not claiming her as his biological parent, but as something far more profound. He was naming her the vessel of his lost past, the living embodiment of the maternal spirit of his entire people. In the heart of his own brutality, he had found his salvation, and he had given a name. The silence that followed the whispered word was absolute. It was as if the universe had paused to absorb the weight of it. Jax and the other bandits were frozen, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and shock. They had followed a predator, a killer they called Cobra. They were now watching that man kneel on the floor, weeping, before a pregnant settler he had just called mother. The first to break the tableau was Jax. His confusion curdled into contempt. "Get up, Taza," he snarled, using a name that was clearly the leader's own. "What in the hell is wrong with you? She's a white woman. She's addled your brain with that witch song." Taza rose slowly to his feet. The transformation was staggering. The broken, weeping man was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely. The emptiness of Cobra was gone, and the raw grief was gone. What remained was a man of immense, sorrowful authority. He was no longer just a bandit leader. He was Taza, a man who had just reclaimed a piece of his soul. He turned to face Jax, and his eyes were clear. "She is not white," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "Look at her. Look at the mark on her wrist. She carries the blood of the NDE. My blood. Our mother's bloodline. And she carries our songs." He turned his gaze back to Alara, and it was filled with a fierce, protective reverence. "She is Nantie. She is sacred." Jax laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Sacred? We were about to kill her. You've gone mad, Taza. The sun's cooked your mind." He raised his pistol, pointing it not at Thomas, but at Alara. "I'll put this sacred thing out of its misery myself." Thomas let out a roar of pure rage, throwing his entire body against the chair, which toppled to the floor with a crash. But he was too late. Before Jax could pull the trigger, Taza moved. He crossed the space between them in two impossibly swift strides. He did not draw his gun. He did not use his knife. He struck Jax with his open palm, a single, whip-crack blow to the side of the head that sent the man sprawling. Jax's pistol clattered across the floor. Taza stood over him, his chest heaving. "No one will touch her," he said, his voice low and deadly. "No one." He looked around at his other men, his eyes blazing. "This is our way. You have forgotten it. You have lived so long as wolves that you have forgotten you were once men. This woman, this child she carries, they are a sign, a chance to remember." A few of the men looked away, ashamed. Others looked uncertain, Their loyalty split between the leader they had known and the strange zealot who now stood before them. "We are leaving," Taza declared. His gaze fell on the mess his men had made. The spilled flour, the broken jars, the desecrated home. A look of deep shame crossed his face. "And we are leaving everything." "What?" another bandit exclaimed. "The food, the supplies we took, all of it," Taza commanded. He walked to his own saddlebags, which were filled with stolen goods from a raid on a freight wagon days before. He emptied them onto the floor, tins of coffee, bags of sugar, smoked hams, bolts of cloth. "And ours, too. We leave it as an offering. A penance." This was too much for some. Jax scrambled to his feet, his face livid. "To hell with you, Taza. You're no leader. You're a crazy man. Anyone who's with me, let's go." 3 of the bandits, including Jax, hesitated for a moment, then backed away toward the broken doorway. They gave Taza one last look of contempt, then disappeared outside. 3 others remained, their expressions conflicted but ultimately loyal to the man they had followed for years, no matter how he had changed. Taza ignored the deserters. He walked over to Thomas and, with his own knife, cut the ropes that bound his wrists. He pulled Thomas to his feet and then helped him set the chair upright. The 2 men stood facing each other, the farmer and the bandit, the husband and the man who had just declared his wife sacred. No words were exchanged. None were needed. An impossible understanding passed between them in the silent room. Taza turned for a final look at Alara. His face was a mask of sorrow and reverence. He knew he could not stay. He knew he could not undo the terror he had brought to this house, but he could honor the miracle he had found within it. "May your son be a great warrior," he said to her, his voice soft, "or a singer of songs. Both are needed." He gave a short, formal nod to Thomas. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the cabin, his remaining men trailing behind him like lost disciples. Minutes later, Thomas and Alara heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the vast indifference of the plains, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more profound than any they had ever known. In the aftermath, the cabin was a strange sanctuary of chaos and peace. The physical evidence of the violation was everywhere: the broken door, the scattered flour, the smashed pottery. But piled in the center of the room was the bandits' penance: food, cloth, and supplies that would last them through the winter and beyond. The air, which hours before had been thick with fear and violence, was now still and heavy with awe. Thomas moved first. He went to Alara, his movements stiff and sore. He knelt before her and took her hands in his. They were trembling. He raised them to his lips and kissed them, then gently pulled her to her feet and held her, burying his face in her hair. They stood like that for a long time, simply holding on, 2 people adrift in the wreckage of their world, their silent embrace a testament to their survival. "Are you all right?" he finally murmured into her hair. "The baby," she nodded against his chest, her own hands coming up to rest on his back. "We're all right, Thomas. We're safe." He pulled back to look at her, his steady blue eyes searching her face. He saw the exhaustion there, the lingering fear, but he also saw something new. A light, a quiet strength that had been forged in the heart of the terror. She was no longer just the woman he loved, the quiet orphan with a mysterious past. She was Alara, the woman who had tamed wolves with a song. She was Nantier. He looked at the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist, a mark he had seen 1,000 times and thought nothing of. Now, it seemed to glow with a secret history. "The song," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Your past, Alara. Do you remember anything?" She looked down at her own wrist, tracing the mark with a fingertip. "No," she whispered. "No memories. Only a feeling." When he said that name, Shadizi, it was like hearing an echo in an empty room. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "All my life, I felt like a page torn from a book. I never knew what story I belonged to." Now, she trailed off, unable to articulate the immense, world-altering shift that had occurred within her. She had been given back a single word from her own lost language, a single note from her own history. It wasn't a full story, but it was a beginning. The lullaby was no longer a ghostly remnant of a forgotten childhood. It was a bridge. It was her inheritance. It was a weapon and a gift. The horror of the night had, in the strangest possible way, given her back a piece of herself. The man they called Cobra, a specter of death and destruction, had been the unlikely messenger of her own identity. Over the next few hours, they moved with a quiet, shared purpose. Thomas, with a new reverence in his touch, began to clear the wreckage. He righted the furniture and swept the flour into a pile, salvaging what he could. Alara, moving with a grace that seemed both weary and energized, began to take stock of the supplies the bandits had left. It was a small fortune, more than they could have hoped to accumulate in a year of backbreaking work. It was blood money, but it was also a gift, an offering. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Thomas found Alara standing in the doorway, looking out at the vast expanse of the plains. The wind gently stirred her hair, and her hand rested on her belly, a gesture that was no longer just protective, but profoundly knowing. She was humming softly to herself. It was the lullaby, but the melody was different now. It was not laced with fear or desperation. It was calm. It was confident. It was hers. He came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. He followed her gaze out into the wilderness, the same wilderness that had produced the monsters of the night before. It didn't look as threatening now. It looked bigger, stranger, more full of secrets and possibilities than he had ever imagined. He looked at his wife, at the incredible, unknowable woman beside him, who carried his child and the ancient songs of a people he knew nothing about. He had set out to build a simple life, a small fortress against the world. But the world had broken down his door and, instead of destroying him, had shown him that his wife was the fortress, and her heart was wider than the whole territory. The future was no less uncertain, the land no less harsh, but they would face it together, forever changed. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, her humming a quiet counterpoint to the whispering wind, a song of survival and rebirth on the edge of the frontier. She stands in the doorway, a silhouette against the endless sky, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. The song she hums is no longer a ghost from a forgotten past, but a promise for a future she is just beginning to understand. He stands beside her, his fear replaced by a quiet awe, knowing the woman he married is a keeper of mysteries far deeper than the land they tame. They have faced the darkness and found an impossible light. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.